For millions of years, the story of humanity was simple. It was the story of survival. Before there were empires, before kings wore crowns, before the first borders were ever drawn on a map, our ancestors lived with one singular, driving purpose: to see the next sunrise. There were no grand systems, no appointed leaders, no elaborate structures of control. Life was raw, immediate, and defined by the daily hunt for food and the constant watch for danger. It was a world of pure freedom, but also of constant peril. But something incredible happened. Humans, unlike many other species, didn't just survive alone. We gathered. We formed small, nomadic bands. We shared the warmth of a fire, the spoils of a hunt, and the burden of watching over our young. We faced down predators, not as individuals, but as a united front. And in this togetherness, in this shared struggle for survival, the seeds of something entirely new were planted. Something that would change the course of our species forever. Power. Now, when you hear the word power, you might think of armies, or conquests, or a king on a throne. But the first power wasn't born from violence. It emerged quietly, organically, from the very act of organization. Imagine a small group. Someone has to decide where to hunt tomorrow. Someone needs to know how to find fresh water. Someone is skilled at tracking game, while another knows which plants are safe to eat and which are poisoned. Suddenly, knowledge becomes a resource. The person who knows where the food is holds a certain sway. Their decision affects everyone's chances of eating tomorrow. This wasn't a formal election. It was a practical reality. The best hunter naturally led the hunt. The wisest elder was consulted when a difficult choice had to be made. This was the birth of the first system. It wasn't about domination. It was about efficiency. It was about increasing the group's chances of survival. But as groups grew larger, so did the challenges. How do you distribute food among 50 people instead of 10? What happens when two strong hunters disagree on the best path? The need for more defined roles, for clearer decisions. This is where we see the transition from informal influence to a more structured form of control. The person who managed the grain storage, who decided how much each family received during a harsh winter, held immense power, not because they wielded a weapon, but because they controlled a critical resource that everyone depended on. Think about it. The very first systems weren't imposed from the top down. They grew from the bottom up, out of necessity. Control wasn't a grab for glory. It was a tool for order. It was a way to manage the growing complexity of human society, the ability to plan for the future, to store surplus food, to organize a collective defense. These were the building blocks of civilization. And at the heart of each block was a decision maker, a coordinator, a leader. Power became intertwined with responsibility. But here's the crucial turning point. What began as a practical solution for survival slowly began to transform as resources became more concentrated. As certain families or individuals consistently held positions of influence, that power started to become permanent. It was no longer just about who was the best at a certain task. It started to be about lineage, about inheritance, about solidifying control not just for one season, but for generations. The informal system of survival was crystallizing into the permanent structures of society. The world we recognize today, with its governance, its laws, its complex economies, it all began here. It began with that fundamental shift when the shared goal of survival gave way to the organized systems of power. The journey from a campfire to a kingdom was a long one, but its first steps were taken the moment humans decided to survive together. The first topic is pure survival. Imagine a world without rules, without leaders, without kings or presidents. A world before power was even a concept. This was the world of our earliest ancestors. Long, long ago, humans lived in a world that did not care one bit whether they lived or died. There were no villages to call home, no houses to shelter in. There were no borders, no nations, no maps. There was only the land, the animals, the unpredictable weather, and constant, unrelenting danger. Every single day began with a question that echoed in the mind of every early human. Will I survive today? Think about that. Not, what will I achieve, or what will I eat for dinner, but simply, will I still be alive when the sun goes down? Food was a constant uncertainty. One day you might find a patch of berries or a lucky catch. The next, you'd find nothing. And hunger was a familiar gnawing ache. And it wasn't just hunger. Predators were everywhere. In the tall grass, in the trees, in the water. Giant cats with saber-like teeth, massive bears, packs of wolves. To them, a lone human was just another meal, an injury. Something as simple as a twisted ankle or a deep cut wasn't just painful, it was often a death sentence. Without medicine, without help, infection could set in, or you'd become too slow to escape the next threat. At this stage of our story, humans were not the rulers of nature. We weren't at the top of the food chain. We were simply a part of it, struggling for our place just like every other creature. The concept of ownership didn't exist. You couldn't own a piece of land or a herd of animals. If you found food, you ate it. If another, stronger creature took it from you, you starved. It was that simple, that brutal. In this world, raw, physical ability was everything. Strength mattered. It meant you could fight off a predator or carry a heavy load. Speed mattered. It meant you could chase down prey or, more importantly, run away from something that was chasing you. Awareness mattered. The ability to spot a flicker of movement in the distance, to smell a predator on the wind, to hear the snap of a twig in the dark. These were the skills that kept you alive for one more day. But there was something else, something that mattered more than all of that combined. It was the one advantage we had, the secret weapon that would eventually change the course of our history. Numbers. A single human was vulnerable, an easy target, but a group of humans, a group could stand their ground. A group could make noise, wield sticks and stones, and fend off a predator that would have easily picked off an individual. Slowly, painstakingly, over thousands of years, our ancestors began to realize a fundamental truth, a truth that would alter everything. Survival was easier. The second topic is fear and cooperation. Fear, it's the oldest instinct, the one that kept our earliest ancestors alive. When a saber-toothed cat roared in the distance, fear told them to run. When a storm gathered, fear told them to find shelter. It was simple, direct, and effective. But what happened when humans stopped being alone? What happened when they formed tribes, groups, communities? You might think fear would lessen, that there's safety in numbers. But that's not what happened. Fear didn't disappear. It multiplied. It evolved. Suddenly, survival wasn't just about you versus nature. It was about you and everyone else. The dangers weren't just outside the group. They were inside it too. Think about it. Food had to be found, but then it had to be shared. A cave offered shelter, but it had to be defended, together. Every day brought new challenges that required group decisions. And this is where a new kind of tension was born. A social tension. Imagine the scene. A small band of early humans huddled together. The hunt was unsuccessful. There's not enough food to go around. Who eats first? The strongest hunters. The children, the elders. What happens when a rival tribe approaches? Who stands on the front line to defend the group? Who gets to hide in the safest part of the cave? These aren't easy questions. In these moments of crisis, of raw, gnawing uncertainty, people looked for one thing: direction. They desperately needed someone to make a choice. And that direction always came from someone. Not because they were a king or a chief. There were no crowns, no titles, no elections. Direction came from the person who acted, the one who broke the paralysis of fear. Someone stood up and said, "We move now." Someone pointed and said, "We hunt there." Someone made the call, "We fight or we run." These weren't commands backed by authority. They were suggestions forged in desperation. But when those decisions led to survival, when moving led to a new, safer camp, when hunting there led to a successful kill, something incredible happened. People started to listen. The next time a crisis hit, all eyes would turn to that same person. Their voice now carried weight. This was the birth of cooperation. But let's be clear, it wasn't about equality. It was about survival. Fear made humans seek guidance, and successful cooperation made them depend on it. Slowly, almost invisibly, certain individuals started to gain influence, not through brute force or intimidation, but through something far more powerful: reliability. If your decisions consistently kept people alive, your voice simply mattered more. It was a currency of trust, minted by fear and backed by results. Each successful choice was another deposit into a bank of influence. But trust is a heavy thing. When an entire group depends on your decisions for their survival, you're no longer just suggesting, you're starting to control outcomes. You're starting to wield power. And this is where humanity crossed a fundamental line, a threshold we've never been able to uncross. Cooperation on a large scale isn't chaotic. It requires coordination. Coordination requires everyone to be on the same page, which requires agreement. An agreement to be reliable requires rules. They were simple rules at first, unspoken but understood. You hunt. You watch the perimeter. You help carry the supplies. These weren't laws written on stone tablets, but breaking them had very real consequences. The disapproval of the group, being ostracized, excluded. In a world full of predators and rival tribes, being cast out was a death sentence. So, fear kept people in line. Survival rewarded those who cooperated, who followed the rules. Without anyone planning it, without a grand design, a silent trade was made. Humans traded a portion of their individual freedom for collective safety. This wasn't a sinister plot. It wasn't evil. It was necessary. It was the only logical step in a world defined by danger. But it changed the very fabric of human existence. Because once we accepted the idea of shared decisions, of rules, of leaders, we created a space for power to take root and grow. From this simple, primal soup of fear and cooperation, the first systems of social order were born. It wasn't a government. It wasn't a kingdom. It was something more fundamental. It was the beginning of hierarchy, the first shadow of the complex societies we live in today. A leader's reliability became authority. Unspoken rules became social norms. The need for safety became the foundation of control. Think about how this echoes through history. Every form of government, every social structure, every law can trace its lineage back to this fundamental bargain. We give up certain freedoms to a central authority in exchange for protection, for order, for the promise that someone else will make the tough decisions when crisis strikes. We still look for direction. We still value reliability and fear, in its many modern forms: fear of instability, fear of poverty. Fear of the unknown still pushes us to cooperate and to accept systems of power. This journey from a lone, fearful individual to a member of a complex, rule-bound society wasn't a single event. It was a slow creeping evolution of our own social DNA. It shows us that leadership isn't just about strength, it's about trust. It shows us that rules aren't just about restriction, they're about survival. And it shows that power, in its purest form, doesn't begin with a crown or a sword. It begins with a choice made in a moment of fear that saves a life and earns a moment of trust. And from that tiny seed, entire civilizations grow. It's a powerful and humbling thought, isn't it? The systems that define our world today started with nothing more than a whisper in the dark, a decision that turned chaos into order, and a group of frightened individuals into a society. The third topic is the first rules. How did we go from total freedom to a world filled with rules? It's a story that begins not with a king or a law book, but with something much quieter: habit. The very first rules didn't just appear one day. They crept in disguised as routine. Think about it. In the earliest human groups, survival was everything, so people started doing what worked. The strongest hunted, the sharpest eyed kept watch. The most careful carried the food back to camp. It wasn't a formal system, just what people did, every time. It was efficient, but what happened when someone broke the pattern? Imagine a hunter deciding he'd rather stay back and rest, or someone on watch duty, falling asleep. The consequences weren't a fine or a prison sentence. They were immediate and real. The group went hungry. The camp was left vulnerable to predators. The reaction wasn't a formal trial. It was social cold shoulders, hard looks, a sudden silence when you approached the fire. Trust, the most valuable currency in a small group, began to erode. In a world where your life depended on the person next to you, losing their trust was a death sentence in slow motion. Suddenly, these unwritten habits weren't just suggestions anymore. They became expectations, and expectations quickly hardened into obligations. People didn't follow these rules because a leader commanded them to. They followed them because they had to. The social pressure was immense. If you wanted to eat, you had to contribute. If you wanted to be safe, you had to protect others. It was a simple, brutal equation. Disobedience didn't lead to a debate. It led to exclusion, and being cast out from the group was one of the worst fates imaginable. Alone, you were weak. Together, you were strong. The group had stumbled upon a powerful tool for control, one that didn't require chains or cages. Consequences. The fear of being pushed out was more effective than any physical threat. This informal system started to shape behavior in profound ways. Those who followed the rules, who did their part without complaint, they got a larger share of the hunt, the best spot by the fire, the respect and trust of the others. Obedience meant safety. It meant belonging. The group was learning to reward conformity and punish individuality when it threatened the collective. Slowly but surely, a structure was forming where there had been none. It wasn't a conscious design. No one sat down and drafted a constitution. It was an organic process, driven by the basic human need for security and predictability. And this new order worked. With defined roles, hunts became more organized and successful. Food was managed better, making it last through lean times. With a dedicated watch system, the group could sleep a little sounder, knowing someone was looking out for danger. Life, in a tangible way, improved. The infant mortality rate might have dropped slightly. People lived a bit longer. And here's the crucial part. When a system makes life better, people will defend that system. They will defend it passionately, even if it limits their personal freedom. The trade-off seemed worth it. This was the great exchange. The first contract humanity ever signed. We gave up a piece of our individual freedom for a slice of collective security. The wild, unpredictable chaos of absolute liberty was traded for the calming rhythm of order. Rules created predictability, and predictability is a powerful antidote to fear. When you know what to expect from others, and what they expect from you, the world becomes a less terrifying place. You can plan, you can cooperate on a larger scale. You can build something that lasts longer than a single lifetime. But this new stability came at a cost. The freedom to do whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, was gone. That spontaneous, untamed spirit was now channeled and constrained by the needs of the group. The world was no longer a blank canvas for individual action. It was becoming a structured grid of roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Humans had crossed a monumental threshold. They had willingly accepted restriction in exchange for stability, and this acceptance would change our species forever. Because once rules exist, they create a new problem. They need to be interpreted. They need to be enforced. What happens when two people disagree on what a rule means? What's the proper punishment for breaking one? The informal pressure of the group could only go so far. As societies grew larger and more complex, a simple cold shoulder was no longer enough. The rules, which had started as silent habits, now demanded a voice. They demanded a guardian. They demanded someone or something to protect them. This was the moment the seeds of leadership, of government, of law itself, were truly planted. The need for an arbiter, a judge, a chief, was born directly from the success of the rules themselves. The system that created order now required a new layer of control to maintain it. And that, right there, is the beginning of the world we know today. Thanks for watching. Have you ever wondered where rules come from? It's a simple question with a profound answer. Rules don't just appear out of thin air. They need a voice. A person to remind others of them. Someone to make decisions when things get complicated. And ultimately, someone to enforce them. This is the story of how authority was born. Life was a constant struggle for survival. The individuals who were best at guiding hunts, the ones who knew where to find water, the ones whose instincts kept the group safe, these were the people everyone listened to. Their expertise wasn't just respected, it was essential. When a hunt was successful, the group ate. When they followed the right path, the group lived. Trust was built on results. So, when a different kind of problem arose, a dispute over food, a disagreement between two members of the group, who do you think they turned to? Naturally, they looked to the same individuals they already trusted with their lives. The skilled hunter became the wise mediator. The one trusted with life or death decisions on the savannah was now trusted with judgment within the community. Their words started to carry a new kind of weight, a weight that went beyond simple survival skills. And a fascinating thing happens when an entire group consistently listens to one voice. Power begins to form, quietly and naturally. This early authority wasn't declared with a grand announcement. There was no coronation, no ceremony. It was simply recognized. Obedience was a form of self-preservation, but belief is an incredibly powerful force. Once someone has the power to decide what is right for the group, they inherently gain the power to decide who is wrong. And this is where everything started to change. Suddenly, some voices mattered more than others. Some opinions were amplified, while others faded into the background. The simple, egalitarian structure of the early group began to dissolve. If you were close to the person in authority, a family member, a trusted friend, you were safer. Your concerns were heard. Your position was secure. Your voice was easier to ignore. Control was no longer just about avoiding a predator or finding the next meal. It started coming from one's position within this new social structure. Authority, realizing its own importance, began to protect itself. When faced with a choice, decisions often favored stability over absolute fairness. New rules were created that prioritized order over individual freedom. This was the critical moment when power stopped being a temporary responsibility, granted for a specific task like a hunt, and started becoming a permanent fixture of society. Humans had unintentionally created something much bigger than themselves, something that went beyond day-to-day survival. They had built a structure, and structures, once built, don't vanish easily. They grow, they evolve, they demand maintenance, and most importantly, they demand loyalty. By the time most people realized how fundamentally their world had changed, authority was already the new normal. And here we arrive at the true turning point in our social evolution. Once something feels normal, questioning it starts to feel dangerous. Challenging the authority figure wasn't just disagreeing with a person anymore. It was threatening the very foundation of the group, the structure that provided order and a sense of safety. This shift from a tool for survival to a self-perpetuating system is one of the most significant, yet subtle, transformations in human history. It laid the groundwork for everything that followed. We are surrounded by layers upon layers of authority. We have laws, governments, corporate hierarchies, and social norms. We consent to these structures, often without a second thought, because they provide order and predictability to our lives. We accept that certain people have the right to make decisions that affect us all. But this acceptance is rooted in that ancient trade-off. We exchange a measure of our personal freedom for the promise of security and stability. The story of authority is not a story of good versus evil. It's a story of human ingenuity and its unintended consequences. The same instinct that led us to cooperate and trust, but it's also the instinct that can lead to inequality and the concentration of power. Understanding this origin story is crucial. It reminds us that authority is a human creation. It's not a natural law of the universe. It was born from necessity, was shaped by belief, and is maintained by our collective acceptance. And because we created it, we also have the power to question it, to shape it, and to hold it accountable. The story isn't over. It continues with every generation that decides what kind of authority it is willing to accept and what kind of world it wants to build. The conversation that started around a campfire tens of thousands of years ago is still happening today, in our homes, in our communities, and in the halls of power. Thank you for watching. The fifth topic is power replaces equality. In the beginning, there was no power, only people. Everyone stood on the same ground. No one owned more than another. No single voice mattered more than the rest. A kind of raw equality existed, not because it was designed, but simply because there was a lack of power. Every meal was shared by necessity, and survival was a collective effort. It wasn't a utopia, it was just the way things were. But a vacuum of power never stays empty for long. Sooner or later, someone has to make a tough call. Who leads the hunt? Who decides where to build a shelter? Who stands guard at night? Once authority was accepted, even for a moment, it began to change its shape. Those who made the decisions found themselves in control of the resources, food distribution, access to shelter, protection from threats, and when you control someone's survival, you hold the strongest form of power there is. At first, this authority was temporary, a role taken on for a specific task. But gradually, it stopped being temporary. It started to become inherited, not through bloodlines, not yet, but through trust, through proximity, through loyalty. Some people were always closer to the decisions being made. Others were always on the outside. Reacting to them, the ground was no longer even. Equality, that quiet, unspoken agreement, began to fade. And here's the most fascinating part. There was no sudden rebellion. There was no dramatic collapse of the old way. It was a slow, quiet acceptance. People told themselves stories to make it make sense. This is necessary, they'd say. This new structure keeps us safe. This is just how it has to be. And in many ways, they were right. Life did become more stable. Communities grew larger and more organized. The systems they built became stronger. But that stability came with a hidden cost. Power created distance. A gap opened up between the leaders and the followers, between the decision makers and those who simply had to live with the consequences. They were now about preserving the control of those in charge. Once the group in power gets to define what is fair, they also get to decide what is unfair. They decide what is allowed and what is forbidden. And in a world where power defines truth, equality cannot survive. Humans adapted to this new reality with incredible speed. We learned to obey. We learned to align ourselves with those in power. We learned to seek benefits from being close to the center of control. The system rewarded loyalty, not necessarily fairness or merit. It was a subtle shift in the social fabric, but it was a profound one. Over time, this new structure of power reshaped our very identities. Some people were leaders by default, simply because of who they knew or who their parents were. Others were followers by birth, their destiny seemingly written for them. What began as a simple, cooperative strategy for survival had slowly, almost invisibly, morphed into structured inequality. And yet, for the most part, humans did not resist this change. Why? Because power, for all its faults, provided something that sheer survival never could. Certainty, the certainty of food, the certainty of protection, the certainty of tomorrow. And faced with the chaos of an unpredictable world, humanity, time and time again, chose certainty over absolute freedom. This wasn't a choice made just once, in some distant, forgotten past. It was a choice made every single day, in countless small ways, and it's a choice that continues to be made today. Think about it. The empires, the nations, the laws, the institutions that shape our world today, all of them can trace their roots back to this fundamental moment. The moment when control became normal. This was humanity's first and most enduring system. And once it was created, once we learned how to build these hierarchies, it never truly disappeared. It just changes its name, its symbols, and its justifications. We see it in corporate ladders, in political structures, in social circles. The desire for order and the concentration of power are two sides of the same coin. We trade a little bit of our autonomy for a little bit of security. It's the oldest bargain in human history. The initial state of equality was fragile, built on the shared vulnerability of survival, but the systems of power that replaced it proved to be incredibly resilient, precisely because they offered a solution to that vulnerability. So, when we look at the world around us and see inequality, it's not some modern corruption of a perfect past. It is the continuation of a story that began the moment one person, his voice, was judged more important than another is. The story of how we traded the wilderness of freedom for the walled garden of certainty. The question isn't whether we can ever return to that initial state. The real question is, what kind of system do we want to build now, knowing the price of power? What new bargains are we willing to make? This journey from equality to power is not just a chapter in a history book. It is the very software running in the background of our civilization. And understanding it is the first step to deciding what we want our future to look like. Thank you so much for watching. If this made you think, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. See you in the next one.